Hello, everybody. Welcome to our very first UA Spotlight. I'm here with David J. Shestokas, who is a lawyer and author of Constitutional Soundbites. I don't know if you can see that. It's a little glare there. But it's a perfect book for today's culture, the soundbite culture. And he's really getting some pertinent information out there in soundbites so that people don't get disinterested and move on. You know, you don't want to be reading like a legal treatise from Yale or anything here. But David and I met actually at CPAC. We had a long discussion on the Constitution. I think I may have mentioned this when he came on the show at Unbiased America Live, that I was talking about the philosophy undergirding the Constitution, and I used the word teleological. And the one thing that David said to me is never use the word teleological ever again, and I got a huge kick out of it, and we've been talking ever since. But how did you come up with this idea to just put it simply and into sound bites? Was it just the prevailing culture, or how did you come up with that?
Well, there's some history behind that, Will. But I will tell you that I go out of my way never to say substantive due process as well. You know, you say things like teleological and substantive due process, and you've lost everybody to begin with. You know, so we're trying not to lose people right from the get-go. You know. But regarding how we came up with the idea, how the book developed, I actually been an attorney for almost 30 years, and I was at one point in time a criminal prosecutor for Cook County in the Chicago area, and spent a number of years doing that. And then I spent a long time afterwards doing criminal defense work, and that is perhaps the single area of law where you live with the Constitution day in and day out. Probably 70–80% of the Bill of Rights is devoted to criminal procedure because, of course, when the government looks to take someone's life, liberty, or property, that's where the founders set in the most protections, because that's the biggest power government has. And so I spent 25–30 years living with the Constitution day in and day out. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I got invited to do a presentation on Constitution Day at a high school in Southwest Florida. I'm also licensed in Florida. And we were doing a Socratic Method kind of thing, and I certainly asked the kids originally, what year did the United States get their independence? And this was an American history class. I figured that it wouldn't be a big problem to start the discussion that way. And the first answer I got was 1800. You know. And then I said, yeah, it was before that. Exactly.
Boy. 18, I mean, just because it was a round number and it was a long time ago, maybe?
Yeah, apparently it was a round number. It was a long time ago. And then I said, well, it was before that. And then the next volunteer was 1700, you know.
Just a round number and a longer time ago. I get it. I see the methodology here.
Yeah. So we zeroed in eventually after a bit of trial on 1776. And I figured not a real tough follow-up question would be, well, what day was that? And that turned out to be tougher than I thought. And eventually I went, okay, hot dogs, fireworks, those kinds of things, picnics, barbecues. Oh, 4th of July.
Oh, man, this is embarrassing. Was the teacher embarrassed?
Yeah, I think.
I'm not sure. I would hope so.
She was sitting way in the back of the room and kind of shaking her head, I think.
Goodness, yeah, that's rough.
Yeah, and that happened. I did 4 or 5 classes that day, and that was pretty much the same story. And I went home shaking my head just like you were shaking your head just now. And I said, I got to do something. I got to do what I can.
Okay.
To do something about this.
Mm-hmm.
Started writing online. I wrote a few things about the 4th Amendment, search and seizure issues. And then I got more questions. The more questions I got, the more I knew that people generally had little knowledge of what the Constitution was about, including the rights and protections. So that online writing turned into my own website. My own website eventually morphed into a radio show that I did for about 3 years out of Southwest Florida and Tampa, called Constitutionally Speaking. And as promos for the show, I would do a minute of constitutionally speaking, and we'd ask one question like, what did Jefferson mean by all men are created equal? And I would answer that in like 60 seconds.
Okay.
And those were promos, the upcoming, and then listen this week, et cetera, et cetera. And I started to collect those things that I did for the promos for the show, and eventually I added to them, and now we've got what amounts to 150 sound bites about the Constitution, sort of FAQs, and that turned into the book, Constitutional Sound Bites.
Okay, so the first part of your book, or what, but first, actually, before we get into that, I want to know, do you believe that people are citizens of the country, or people that want to be citizens have an obligation to understand the founding period and the Constitution? That they have there should be some requisite to being a citizen of knowing this stuff?
I think there's an absolute obligation of knowing this stuff. America's a very, very special place in certain instances. You and I speak English. I think your English is better than mine. I've never used teleological in my life.
I'll never live that down.
But we could both of us could go and live in London for 20 years, right? And pledge allegiance to the Queen. So would we ever be British?
No.
That's right. But if you study, learn, subscribe to the philosophies, because this was the first place in the history of the world founded on a philosophy.
Yep.
You study, understand, subscribe to the philosophy, you can, in fact, become American.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only place in the world where that's the case. That's the case. My Spanish is getting better day by day, but I would never be Costa Rican, even if regardless of how long I lived there. But the interesting thing about that is you can become American and still not give up what your personal family heritage is. Which is why we have these things that we call bifurcated Americans, Lithuanian Americans, Italian Americans, et cetera, et cetera. But they're still, when you get done with the hyphen, they're still all Americans.
Right. There's that common ideal, that common philosophy that binds us all together, right? Those ideas of life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness, right?
That's exactly right. And we don't, somehow or other, while in fact, I would suggest that there is an obligation, as you asked, about on the part of people wanting to be part of the community and participate in America. I suspect and suggest that those of us who do understand and have subscribed to that philosophy have an obligation to explain it ourselves, explain it to folks who are new here.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. The best part of your book that I notice is I can take your book and I can open it to any page, any place, and I don't need to read from front to back. I can just open it to the middle and just be captivated by what's in it without having to know the rest. You answer them in just questions that are like frequently asked questions, and you can just learn a ton by opening to any page. What would you want readers to take away from the introduction to Volume 1 and Volume 1, the beginning of the Constitution, how it started, and the Declaration of Independence, and so on?
Well, I think, when we talked before on Unbiased America, you mentioned the situation regarding rich old white guys, and the criticism that the founders come under with that, and how they're dismissed sometimes by that. I think there's a story that's in the prologue of the book that dispels that fact in some respect, and not that fact, dispels that allegation in some respect. They'd worked for 4 or 5 months in the heat of Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, and in the future we'll talk about why that gets to be called the miracle of 1787 in some respects. But nevertheless, they finish up on September 17th, which is now recognized as Constitution Day, and then it was going to be sent out to the states for ratification. They did it in Philadelphia, which was in Independence Hall. What we now call Independence Hall is also where they drafted the Constitution. But interestingly enough, Philadelphia was the capital of Pennsylvania at the time. And the Pennsylvania legislature also met in the same building as the Constitutional Convention was going on. And they were meeting upstairs. So September 17, 1787, all they had to do to get the newly drafted Constitution to the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania legislature was walk the document upstairs. And that's precisely what they did. You know, I mean, so it was simple. It took a lot longer to get out to other places, Virginia, and you know, because they were going by horseback, and as far as I know, they didn't even have, there was no Pony Express established, and so it took a long time to get the document around the rest of the colonies or the rest of the states. But in Pennsylvania, they walked it upstairs. Pennsylvania legislature on the very first day ordered 4,500 copies to be sent out to the citizens of Pennsylvania for begin the purpose of ratification, begin the process of ratification. And here's the interesting part of the story. The Pennsylvania legislature did not order 4,500 copies in English. The Pennsylvania legislature only ordered 3,000 copies in English. The other 1,500 copies they ordered printed for distribution were in German. And now when you say these rich old white guys that didn't care anything about anybody, I think it's important to understand that the very first day, the process of inclusion that we are still experiencing these days is what got underway. They wanted the people to understand. They wanted the people who were going to be affected by this to have an understanding. And the best way for them to have an understanding was, of course, to give them the information in their native language. And so I think the takeaway from the prologue to Constitutional Soundbites, which is much longer than than we talk about on the regular FAQs. They're all designed because unfortunately, who's going to read the Federalist Papers today?
Yeah, not many people.
You know, so frankly, the takeaway from that is that the process of inclusion that was started, that we continue to expand upon, was started by the very first group on the very first day that the document was finished. And I think it's really, really important for people to understand and not diss these guys. Speaking of which, regarding rich old white guys, the main ultimate drafter, the ultimate penman of the Constitution, as James Madison called him, was a fellow by the name of Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris actually wrote the Constitution. They had like 28 different articles and all kinds of amendments. If they would have had sticky notes in those days, you would have had the sticky notes all collected, and et cetera, et cetera. And the Committee on Style that they put together, essentially, sort of like the Declaration of Independence became a one-man job. Ultimately, the Constitution became a one-man job. And Gouverneur Morris, in 4 days, took all the stuff they'd been doing for 4 or 5 months, organized those 28 articles into the 7 articles we know, organized them into the situation we know, and also rewrote the opening to the preamble.
Wow.
And Gouverneur Morris was 35.
Why do you think he's more forgotten than, say, James Madison? I mean, who's considered the father of the Constitution, rightly so, but nobody ever brings up Gouverneur Morris.
Madison kept the best notes.
So he's the guy who keeps the best notes.
Yeah, Madison had by far the best notes of the Constitution and of the Constitutional Convention, and people relied greatly on Madison's notes. And besides all that, Madison came as the man most prepared to discuss a completely new form of government. Of course, the convention was called originally for theoretically the purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation. That's not, of course, what they did in the end. Madison showed up with the intention of writing a brand new document. Mm-hmm. And Madison had spent, though, and we're going to talk about Madison probably in the next segment, because we've got 4 guys that are featured at the beginning of the book, and Madison's among them. And so we'll talk about Madison and perhaps why. And certainly I'd say he's a better publicist than Morris as well.
Mhm. Okay, that makes sense. So that's why James Madison's really considered the father of the Constitution. And you'd really have to look into the Constitution to understand the role that Gouverneur Morris really played with the Committee on Style and piecing it together. So that's some interesting information. The best tidbit of information, I think, is that before we even had a United States of America, you had the founders and framers that were including different peoples with a different language. By printing, I think it was 1,500 constitutions in German to incorporate them into this nascent republic. I think it's very interesting.
And that story in Pennsylvania was not the only place that such a thing took place. If you remember, if people still study these things, I don't know. But before,
nope.
Before New York was New York, it was New Amsterdam, and had originally been settled by the Dutch. In about 1615, 1616, or somewhere in that range, the English took it over, but there still remained a huge Dutch population in New York. And at the time, when the Constitution finally did show up in New York and got distributed, it was not only distributed in English, it was also distributed in Dutch.
That's interesting.
So the story in New York and the story in Pennsylvania, probably next to Virginia, the two largest, most influential states at the time, was the story of inclusion from the very first day.
Wow. So we only have about 30 seconds left, but this is very interesting that the Constitution and the Republic itself was more about inclusion than exclusion. And they really wanted to spread from the beginning the philosophy of the Declaration of Independence, of life, liberty, and property.
That's precisely the case.
Wow.
Right from the very beginning, it was more inclusion than exclusion.
So your book is really, your book being informative is really about dispelling a lot of these contemporary myths. It's interesting. I think it's perfect. I think people really need to buy the book and they should follow along in our series. And this is perfect for parents, actually, with students in college that are going to get fed a lot of this stuff. So it's good to have this to read to bolster their armory a bit when they debate their teachers, I hope, in class, and stick up for the Constitution. But please join us next time. Get the book. We will be back with part 2 where we'll get into more discussing Madison and more about the Constitution. And we'll see you next time on UA Spotlight. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Please buy David Shestokas' book. You can buy it on Amazon.com. Also, follow him on Twitter at Shestokas, right? Is it just at Shestokas?
At Shestokas, Shestokas.
And on Facebook, you can find he has a page as well. You can follow him there. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Will.